Next will be the Coastal Zone Management Seawall Design Public Meeting. Are we, public meeting style or just a presentation?
It's just a presentation.
What do we?
Make a decision on the direction that you would.
No, it isn't a public hearing.
It's not.
No.
Public meeting. Okay. Kindly introduce yourself and we'll get things going.
Yes. Good evening. My name is Trey Ruthven. I'm from Sustainable Coastal Solutions.
Keep moving
Sorry.
around a little. There you go.
Good evening. My name is Trey Ruthven. I'm from Sustainable Coastal Solutions. This is
Jeremy Packard of Fulton Infrastructure and Environment.
and in gray, who you just met, is Sam Haynes. He's with Coastal Zone Management. We're here to talk about a project that the town has undertaken through the Coastal Zone Management Coastal Resiliency Program to look at Apponagansett Park and Diaz Landing. If I can. Right. Green. Oh, that's good. That's
It was working earlier. He had it up.
Brief technical
So
respite.
this is when we need that music.
Talk amongst yourselves.
Open up the display,
Quietly.
display properties.
It just worked actually last time. There was something there to do.
It worked earlier.
Yeah.
We can see it on the TV.
Drop it maybe.
Frank. Frank's got it. Frank. It's over Frank, isn't it? Oh, no.
He's there.
Oh, there it goes.
We're right with you out there.
No problem. Sorry about that.
Oh,
We can wait.
here it comes.
Free advertising.
Like people. Sony.
You just watch it on TV.
Yeah. What is this? A Best Buy advertisement?
There you go.
Technology is never
That's
fast.
going. That's okay.
Could have watched it on TV.
All right. So I just wanted to cover where we've gotten to at this stage. We've been working on this grant for a little over a year now with some starts and stops, but moving along very well. So part of what I wanted to do is define resiliency so everyone understands what that means and how we're taking that into account when we're looking at how to address the issues with Apponagansett Park. Also discuss CZM resiliency grant goals, coastal hazards that the park is facing, our conceptual designs, and our next steps forward. So what is resiliency? NOAA has a very good way of defining it in a very short number of words. So coastal resiliency means building the ability of a community to bounce back after hazardous events such as hurricanes, coastal storms, and flooding, rather than simply reacting after the fact. And how does that tie into this grant that the town has gotten through MCZM? So these MCZM grants are generally the order of a 1 or 2 year period, and they help communities and nonprofits throughout the state with financing, and really technical support is really where these grants come in handy to support awareness in the community, but also understanding climate change, identify vulnerabilities, and how to kind of adapt for this going forward. They're also very useful when it comes to the regulatory part of implementing these projects. So what coastal hazards does Dartmouth face? There's 4 mainly. You can see in the bottom gray part of the photograph, you can see that, obviously, as we all know, Dartmouth's protected from, northeast events, but we will experience tropical events, so hurricanes pushing storm surge up. Most of our storm fetches, the distance wind blows over when it's generating waves, are fairly short. That means less wave energy coming in. But as we look at storm surge, sea level rise, waves, and then erosion that occurs from all of those, we can anticipate what's going to happen. If anybody's been out to Apponagansett Park lately, these photographs will not be surprising. The top photos, the parking lot at Diaz Landing, The bottom photo right on the left is going out towards the point where you can see the seawall's been eroding behind. Salt water is actually intruding the park, taking away turf, which is also similar to the photo on the right. Here's another one. This is looking from west to east towards Dias Landing. And you can see wave overtopping, wave run up, slowly eroding the park surface, pulling it out into the harbor, but also jeopardizing the infrastructure that is in place. It's closer to Dias Landing where the parking lot's being impacted. So the question is, why is this happening? So if we look at the elevation of the park, it's color coded. So obviously the blues and greens are lower in elevation. When we get to the reds, they're higher in elevation. But the one thing that's important is that orange range in the middle is generally 2 to 4 feet in elevation. So when we start talking about, is that high or is that low? That's actually very low. High tide is roughly on the order of 2 feet. So when we're at elevation 2, it's getting wet a lot. Annual high tides.
Just flooded.
Annual high tides cause more flooding, especially when we add storm surge in. We looked at Newport's tide gauge from 1930 to spring of 2022 to figure out, how often do we face these events. So we looked at storm records where we had a storm surge 2 feet above high water. That happened 41 times over that period. So these don't happen every year, but they're very frequent. And when we start looking at sea level rise, it actually shows how much more frequently that's going to be. And these are all small storms again. We're talking 2 feet of surge. That's not very high. When we try to relate these to FEMA and storm surge mapping, you can see what that effects have here. So the top photo on the right-hand side, that's the 10-year storm as defined by FEMA. And you can see a majority of the park is underwater. The bottom photo is the 100-year event. You can see the park has 6 to 7 feet of water on top of it. And these are still water elevations, so these don't have the effect of waves on top of them. You can see the values in NAVD, so when we're talking in elevations later on, 2, 4, 6, you can see it's elevation 6 is about the 10-year event. 50-year event is just under 10 at 9.6. 100 years, 11.7. So when we're talking about minor coastal storms and big coastal storms, let's talk about sea level rise and how that's going to affect us going forward. So what you can see here is Newport's tide gauge plotted out from 1930 to 2022. The one thing that's been interesting is you have yearly fluctuations, but it's generally progressing on a linear trend. So what we're seeing is about 0.11 inches per year, or about every century, about 0.9 feet, so just under a foot. So that means, coastal storms that we had, 100 years ago, so 1920, they're about 1 foot higher now, same exact storm. So that's also why when we talk about resiliency, we have to take that into account and build that into, especially infrastructure that was designed or implemented historically, because they were never designed to actually handle these new water levels that we're facing. So this is the linear trend that we've been saving now. When we start looking at projections, the projections look a little more dire. So the green line you can see in the figure, that's the linear trend that we've seen. The projections on the right-hand side of that figure are the various sea level rise projections, varying from intermediate to extreme. Generally, when we're looking at CZM projects, we're using the intermediate high, so the second one down. So that says by 2030, we're 0.9 feet higher. By 2050, we're 1.8. So this is all on top of that foot we've already gathered from the 20s. The one thing that I will say, looking at these projections, NOAA's just come out with some new projections based on some IPCC data. And they're a little bit lower than CZM has been projecting in the States. So they would kind of fall between the white bars and the green bars. So not quite as extreme as the dark blue bars on top, which is good because that actually makes adapting infrastructure much easier to deal with. And obviously these projections are projections, they're not, data. So when we're talking about sea level rise, and this is what I was talking about a little bit earlier, and what effects it has. You can see on the left-hand side, sea level rise in 1950 with storm surge on top, just barely getting at the base of the buildings. But we go to 2010, we see the sea level rise higher, that pushes storm surge higher, and all of a sudden now we have flooding. So we're going to see this all through, southeast Massachusetts and actually all through the United States and the East Coast as this keeps going on. But that kind of gives you an idea of where we start talking about nuisance flooding. And so we have infrastructure that's been built. Our tides keep going up. And that means on a, not necessarily daily basis, but multiple times a month or even on a weekly basis, we have flooding, and that becomes nuisance flooding. It doesn't cause significant damage, but it does make moving around the community more difficult. It does cause some infrastructure damage, and those are becoming more pronounced and getting harder and harder to ignore. The next part, we looked at trying to figure out what impacts are facing the park. We took a look at the wind data. So on the top right, you'll see a rose graph. So the rose graph represents the compass points if you go around. You'll see there's each segment of the pie there has color coding. Lighter means lower, and as it comes out, probability increases. So you can obviously see from the southwest as a predominant wind direction, which we all know. And also, we look to the directly to the east, it's lower occurrence, but those obviously are longer lasting storms and have an impact. We took this wind data and built a numerical model. You can see the bathymetry on the left and just a simple case of what waves were generated on the right-hand side. And looking at a variety of conditions, we're generally seeing, 1 to 2 feet under extreme conditions in the harbor, which is not very big. But when we start looking at the elevations, the seawalls we have, the overtopping it occurs, when we go back to the photographs we saw earlier, it all kind of comes together and goes, these facts are all agreeing, and this is why we have issues. So how can the town of Dartmouth make Apponagansett Park more resilient? So leading into that discussion, this is what came from Cody, but came also from a bunch of the other departments as we started this project. And they were kind of design goals. And they wanted a pragmatic solution and practical solutions to mitigate the hazards. Realizing the constraints the town were under, they were looking for affordable solutions. They definitely wanted to preserve public usage of the park, which will obviously come into discussion later as we present alternatives. If we could integrate whatever our solutions into the existing infrastructure, that would be good. Minimize footprint. And that comes from 2 different avenues. Obviously, we want to preserve the infrastructure in the park, take up as that, but we also have natural resources immediately offshore. We have oyster beds, we have salt marsh. And if we start pushing our structures seaward, we start impacting those areas, and that also makes regulatory permitting very difficult. And if possible, any of our solutions, could they be multi-purpose? So we've talked about big storms, we've talked about little storms, we've talked about how do we increase resiliency. And so here's what I wanted to kind of show. So the top photo shows water elevation at 3 feet. So at 3 feet, we're keeping the water on the outside of the park, basically. As we progress down to 4 feet, it starts migrating inward. And at 5 feet, over half the park is now wet. So when we talk about resiliency, can we start keeping water levels for lower elevation coastal storms or higher frequency, lower impact coastal storms on the outside of the park? When we look at the 100-year storm, Apponagansett Park is not critical infrastructure. If we have a big hurricane and it floods, the town has lots of other issues besides this park. But this park flooding multiple times a year does put a drain on DPW because they have to go out and clean it up. It does put a impact on the harbor because they have to go out and clean up the boat ramp, clean up the parking lot. And so if we can start addressing those issues and allow those departments to focus on other things, that makes this park more resilient, but also more usable for the public in town. So what are alternatives for increasing resiliency? So there's 3 main areas we're going to talk about. You can see them color-coded. The first is the beach on the western side. The second is the seawall running along the northern side. And the third is also a seawall, but they're the pocket beaches where you have lots of dinghy storage, and you actually have sandy beaches in there where the dinghy storage currently goes. The other piece that runs both in between the first and the second is the head, or rubble head, kind of at the northwest corner of the park, which we'll talk about in a second. So when we look at the western beach, one of the things that's very interesting is it's all about elevation 4. So as we talked about storm surge levels, it's very low. And at elevation 4, it doesn't overtop on a tidal basis yet, but annual high tide is not getting very far from that. And so the one thing that's very apparent when we look at that beach is that there is no coastal dune behind it. So one of the easy aspects of increasing elevation, keeping the function of the beach, would be to place a small, low coastal dune. So you can see there in yellow, it's a coastal dune. Its berm crest across the top is about 10 feet. It actually raises the height of, it's about 2.5 feet in height. So not very high, lower than my waist. So a small feature, 1 on 3 slopes on the front side and back side. That would actually start stopping the water from cresting in through that western side. It would also be beneficial to the beach because as this coastal dune, as it erodes over time, which it will, it'll be something that has to be maintained, not on a yearly cycle, but on a long-term cycle. That sand will actually go down and keep nourishing the beach. So that will actually keep that function going. Building a coastal dune like this will require some modifications to the park. The backside of the beach right now has a row of trees that are in it. Those would likely have to be moved landward if they were to be kept. There's also a playground area that would have to be moved landward again. There's also 2 areas of picnic benches too, and those could be pulled also landward into the park. So there'd still be a lot of access, but we could also cut off water, preserve the beach going forward. When we go to the northern side, we have the seawalls, which are stacked stone. They've obviously been crumbling for years and are in disrepair. So our suggestion is to kind of hold the line there, and within that footprint, because these are permitted structures by the state, Chapter 91 licenses, we could rebuild those structures in place using a concrete seawall coming up higher. For aesthetics, we could add a stone fascia and modify it. But that, again, we're taking up to elevation 6.5, so we're cutting off that water access to the park. The one thing that's interesting on the front of the seawall is we have this really nice cobble habitat. And when we talk about cobble beaches, we're generally talking about energetic beaches, so like South Coast beaches or beaches on the east facing along the state. These cobble beaches are fairly amazing in that it's a mix from sand all the way to cobble. And the one thing that's really nice about them is they adjust to wave energy coming in. And so you'll see berms being formed, it dissipates wave energy. And so one of our suggestions in the areas we can, when we get to the far western side, there's salt marsh, so this wouldn't be, we would tailor it back. But along most of that section was we can put a cobble nourishment in front of the seawall. That cobble nourishment will enhance the rocky intertidal habitat. It'll be compatible with the material that's out there. It'll be rounded stone. We've already had the discussion where, is it angular like we're seeing in Walden? No, it's natural glacial run that we get, and we'll put it in. So that would also enhance that offshore habitat. At the same time, by building that beach in front of that seawall, we're dissipating wave energy before it comes in. So right now we have waves come in, hit the wall, and the wave over top. And you can see the splash zone on the backside of the park where it's pulling sediment straight out through the wall, and also killing the grass because we have the saltwater intrusion. The one thing we can talk about on the backside, and this has been a discussion between the Parks Department, our master, and also with Cody, is what do we do on the backside? Because we're going to have about a 2.5 foot elevation gain. So there's a couple of options. We can have a seawall that just kind of sticks up and people can walk up against it and, sit on it. Be a feature that, on a sunny day could be very used. Other options, we could build a small kind of dune area at the back that tailors down to the existing elevation of the park. The nice thing about that feature is we could put native vegetation in there that is actually saltwater tolerant. And so you'd have this nice natural zone right along the seawall that would be environmentally sensitive, bring back native plant species to the park, but also have that smooth transition going through. And you can see that there It doesn't show very well from this far, but it's there in yellow. Other options are you could, if you didn't want to do additional nourishment, you could just actually increase the grade of the park and tailor it in. So you'd be more soils that you're used to with grass on top. One issue that I have with putting grass on top is you're going to see the same issues that you have now. Like grass is pulling back or eroding that sediment. It's really not designed to be getting inundated on a regular basis. The nice thing about this northern section is the infrastructure within the park is landward enough that we can build these features without actually impacting any of that. One thing we can consider with all of these infrastructure parts, as we redevelop and increase resiliency, we can talk about how the usage of the park gets, how it gets used throughout the year, and if there's any modifications that actually might improve the park overall while we're increasing resiliency. But our goal currently is to minimize impacts to that, to keep our budget low and to make this practical. So now we're over to the third section. So we have these pocket beaches that are over by the Diaz Landing. The one thing we've heard is that, dinghy storage is really tight in town. And was there a way to stop water from inflowing into that parking area, but also not jeopardize those features that a lot of people in the town use? And so, again, we were looking at going from a cobble, so a mixed sediment nourishment, to a sand nourishment, because those are sandy beaches. So we could increase the beach footprints in those areas, increase dinghy storage, also dissipate wave energy further offshore before it hits the seawalls, which would all be fantastic. The one thing that we need to keep in mind when we have the seawall in this area is people are accessing the beach in front of the seawall as a regular transit because they're going to their dinghies, they're going off to their boats. With the sea level or a seawall increase of 2.5 feet, we're going to have to put stairs in. So there will be, whether it's wooden stairs, it could be stone stairs, that's adaptable of what that looks like. But there is going to be that transit over the wall, which we can't avoid if we're going to actually stop water from intruding into the park. So again, this is same thing, and you can see where the boat parking is in the backside. This is kind of an overview again, similar to the last photo. You can see over in pink on the left-hand side is the dune enhancement. In blue is the cobble nourishment with the pink bar in between, which is the seawall where it's increasing. The one point I was talking about earlier was the cobble headland, kind of the northwest. That area is fairly low. That structure has not been licensed. To license that structure would be difficult. Our suggestion is to leave it in place, but we can enhance the elevation through building a dune on the back side of it. We can vegetate that area and make it more natural instead of just being, currently it's concrete, granite. It's a mix of stones from different sources. But we could restore that in a sense that we're bringing the natural environment back into there. But that would also close that gap and also let it tie directly into our seawall, which you can see running down the other side of the park. So the next steps for this project, we've been having meetings with town departments, but this is our first kind of stepping out in public. So we'd like to continue public outreach, hear from the town and the townspeople about what they see for their park, what they think of our ideas. After doing that, we would like to have a pre-filing meeting with the agencies. That will give them an opportunity to give us feedback on our design before entering that regulatory environment. At that point, we can incorporate both the public and the agency feedback into our design, finalize the design. And the last step of this grant is to actually step into the permitting environment and actually submit permit applications to MIPA, Town Conservation Department, DEP, CZM, and the Corps of Engineers. So that kind of wraps it up. I'm trying to keep this quick and short. Any questions?
Rather depressing at first.
Coastal, I mean, it's amazing looking at towns. I mean, we do this all over. I will say Dartmouth looks way better than Nantucket, and when you start plotting what these things are in Nantucket, it's a good portion of
Nantucket, where-
downtown.
Where's that?
Something, it's in the ocean.
Okay.
Right.
So, but
That's why it looks that way.
it is. But you have, those towns which were developed very low, and that's the nice thing about Dartmouth is that we come up fairly quickly, which does make life a lot easier to adapt, as opposed to communities that are flat, low, and currently in the floodplain.
Well,
Mr. Mc-
also
hang
looking
on,
recently at,
Go ahead.
sorry.
Okay, go ahead.
I was saying recently looking at the storm surge of the two most recent hurricanes down in Florida, the one most recently, seeing just, buildings and homes and hotels and just uninhabitable.
Absolutely.
It's coming our way.
It
And
is.
I think we need to wake up and do what we can now.
It's a good point. And, this is a discussion we've had with multiple towns. And the one thing, especially looking at the park here is you get this back and forth. And especially when we start talking about sea level rise, what it will be, what it won't be. And all of these discussions is, we can look at infrastructure in two different functions. There's critical infrastructure that provides evacuation routes. It's fire departments, it's police stations, hospitals. Those have to be designed to a higher standard where they're really functional year round, regardless of what's happening. But when we start talking about town parks, they're very important to the town. They're very important to the public, but they're not critical infrastructure. So we can design them to withstand a lot, but we're not designing for those big, massive events. I mean, if we go back to the 100-year storm, we're not going to put 8-foot walls around this park. If so, we would have this nice wall, but no one would see anything. There'd be no point in being a park anymore. So this is where we can get adaptive and look at, how do we take a step back, increase the resiliency so we can keep using this facility into the future, but realizing that, like all these things, it's going to require maintenance, and at times it will get flooded, and that's part of the design. But that also keeps it usable. So,
Mr. McDonald.
Okay. Well, at some point in time, 60% of the population of the United States has to realize they live on the coast, on both coasts. So, one of the things that you had asked about or suggested is public outreach. And I know you're working with Cody, you're working with Sean. Have you discussed anything with the parks?
We have an internal team put together that consists of Tim Lancaster, Steve Mello, myself, and Mark Garrett. We've been working with Drake throughout the entire
Okay.
process.
All right. Well, if you got Tim in there, that he pretty much speaks for that entire board. So, for the most part. So, he'll keep. I know he keeps. I just want to make sure Parks and Rec are involved in this too. So. Yeah, no, I would say that the next step would be probably to hold some kind of a workshop here, and then invite the stakeholders to come in. So at least you'll have the technology working hopefully a little bit faster, but you also have a room available where people can come in, because there's a lot of people that use that park.
no, and that's kind of the goal. I mean, and in a setting like that, it's great to have full-size plans where they're printed out and people can draw on them or take Post-it notes and post their concerns on them, and it makes it adaptable because they could reach out and see what they're doing. And so obviously the setting's a little bit different than that type of public meeting, but obviously starting with the select board is important to get your feedback, so you also, when we do go to the public and you start hearing about what we're up to or what we're doing, you have a perspective on the work we've done and where we're going, and can then take those concerns and obviously pass them back through the departments that get to
Right.
us.
And when you start talking about a seawall, that I know we're not talking about the size of the New Bedford Dike, so not even close. But at least something to to knock back the erosion a little bit, just to kind of keep it where it's supposed to be. And Tim knows full well that whenever there's a big storm or that it does get flooded, and it does damage the infrastructure where the town has to put in significant sum of money to repair, clean up, and repair. We can hedge our bets, we can do what we can, but everybody talks about a 100-year storm. Well, it seems like these 100-year storms are coming every 20 years. So it's not like,
No, and obviously coastal storms are forecasted to continue to get stronger, more frequent, and the interesting thing, I'm a big data guy, as opposed to projections are good, but it's evident, looking at sea level rise and looking at the impacts, especially historic storms have had. When we talk about a foot, you think, oh, that's not that much. When we start going down to the beach, and you look at the elevation change between the intertidal zone and the upper part of the beach. When we start talking a foot or 2 feet, that's a fairly broad range, and so it drastically, that small change in elevation, drastically pushes in where it goes. And we could even see that with the images of flooding earlier, where we went from 3 feet to 4 feet. There's 1 foot, and we drastically changed how much that park is flooded. And so, whether it's a park or some other part of the community, these small changes have big effects. And so, we're not even talking, big storms or things like, happened in Florida. A simple foot, 1 foot.
no, I mean, just, come August, everybody around here is whipping out their hurricane tracker app on their phone, so they just to kind of keep an eye on what's going on. So, and then this time of the year, it's like, okay, we're pretty good now.
Yeah.
We're out of it for a while.
Right.
So,
Ms. Brooks?
yeah, we got the nor'easters in the winter.
It may not be the 100-year storm, but I've been at a few Wednesday night summer concerts where towards the end we're watching the water come up right to the bandstand and looking at people leaving, through the water. And I know that Tim and Becky are then, really anxious. And so it's not the 100-year storm. It's the Wednesday night concert that we have thousands of people in attendance and the water's coming in.
Yeah, you have high tide with a southwest breeze, and even our typical summer southwest breeze, they push water up in the harbor, and so once it goes up,
And it's exactly that seawall area where it's coming through.
and again, we're not talking a storm. This is typical, summer
Wednesday.
winds. It's blowing 18 knots or something like that, and it pushes water up, and you add a few inches, and all of a sudden, your beach chair, which is sitting in the grass, is all of a sudden getting wet instead of being on the beach. So
Absolutely.
again, these are the small things that when we talk resiliency,
Any comment,
Looking
Mr.
forward.
Gracie?
No, I'm still good.
I,
Listen intently.
Okay, I just would like to add that, what a privilege it is. I think here we are as a group trying to improve our town in a way that it requires, and I'm thinking of all the groups involved that have to make this work: conservation, DPW, waterways, parks. It doesn't end. And as a town, we owe it to ourselves and all the people who live here that we make sure that we work together to get it done, because without it, we're not going to get it done. And I think having you here with this kind of presentation is the way we need to keep things going.
No, and I have to agree. I mean, obviously, hearing the presentation before mine, the involvement and even touching on our project in a sense, and obviously Jeremy's from Foth, and so the dock extension is goes right back to his office. But it's even interesting. I started talking about this project 5 years ago, and it took 3 years to get grant funding for it.
Yep.
So. It is an involved process that takes, all of us, staying on top of it and to get these done, because if we don't, we can easily see what's going to happen, and that'd be a shame. So yes, thank you very much, and I appreciate your time.
Yes, thank you.
And hopefully, when we reach out,
I have one more
Oh, yes.
question. So looking at these projects, and certainly you need town input, which
Yes.
you're going to be looking for at these meetings, and, the coordination of the other groups. But as Patty Zwerdak told us, of all the grants, are there grants available to us for, if we,
The project
if we,
itself.
the project itself, for the dunes, for the seawall?
Sure. So obviously, this is a grant project to start with.
Yeah.
But yes, so CZM does have, through their resiliency program, does have implementation grants. And the one thing, and Sam can step up and talk about this, but I've had projects that have started from this, design kind of, what are our ideas, through permitting, and they're now being implemented. A great one is Plymouth Long Beach. we looked at how to restore the dunes out on Long Beach. It's went from permitting design, and they just got $2 million to start implementing the project. So there's definitely resources available. And the nice thing with being involved with CZM and also the agencies where they get involved early is they take an interest. They like these projects where they can help implement this and
Right.
make these happen. And so that actually increases, I wouldn't say they'll say it decreases, but it definitely increases your likelihood of getting funding later on. I mean, it's just,
Yep.
so yeah, there are lots of
important.
options going forward. And yeah, it's just a matter of watching how they come out and occasionally changing up some of your steps might move forward or backwards a little bit to set you up for that grant cycle.
No pressure, Cody, but
I think it speaks well for Sean's overall direction and Cody's, he's showing us now that he's an expert in trying to find the money and the process to get it done, so.
He's done a
Anybody
good
else
job.
have any comments anywhere? Okay. We need to vote or anything to do with this? Nothing.
No, we don't need to vote tonight. It's just to hear the options that have been presented.
Thank you.
Great job. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.